Support for the voice appears to be trending downward, but I am reluctant to trust to polls. I remember well the surprises that happened in the past, especially in the 2010s when impossible things occurred. If the media was more interested in reporting the public mood rather than trying to shape it, we might have a better barometer in terms of how our compatriots think. We must instead rely on elections and referendums to take the pulse of the polis. A colleague of mine in her toilet has a timeline of reconciliation on the wall. This timeline is always urging one final assault against the spectre of racial inequality, one final push to Berlin. Victory is always just around the corner, as it was with Mabo versus Queensland, then the native title stuff that followed, and again in that walk across the Harbour Bridge in 2000. Who can forget how close we came when Kevin Rudd made eyes watery in 2008? But the enemy, our incalcitrant and unapologetic national whiteness, is always sneaky enough to make it out stage left before the final curtain. There's always room for a sequel that promises to tie up the arc once and for all. The worst of this humbug, one that has become a feature of our public life generally, is that expressing the right sentiments is now enough to classify you as being among the elect. This is the fate of all societies that politicize their moral Weltanschauung, something that ought to be guarded against by those of us with slightly more nuanced understanding of conscience. But to expect ordinary people not to take shortcuts when shortcuts are proffered by the disingenuous is a great deal to ask. In an age where everything is microwavable and we are always working toward the instant, it's satisfying to be able to launder your principles with a few mealy-mouthed sentiments. It's a little like a secular sola fide doctrine. You just have to have the right gushes, and you'll have paid your guilty white person tax until the next time an indulgence is due. That none of this does much good, other than weaken resolve to oppose certain Commonwealth-funded projects of largesse, seems beside the point. Things never seem to get better for our first Australians. Indeed, if things were to improve, it would be a disaster for those who are gainfully employed as stage managers for that timeline. The last thing they need is to lose their cause du jour, like a psychotherapist at risk of losing his most dependent client. It would be tempting, while we're on the subject, to diagnose them all with Munchausen by proxy, were it not the sad truth that there is nothing invented or exaggerated about just how bad things are in some corners of our country. Quibbles about the effectiveness of our indigenous policies seem to miss this key point, that it is less about those who receive and more about those who give. The indigenous industry has ramped into high gear as the vote lurches closer, and you can see the parties who expect a payday. The twin horns of their strategy is to remind you that you're basically Adolf Hitler on the one hand, and that things are Mogadishu out there on the other, though never too much. If you make too much out of this Mogadishu, then the mark might figure out he's got little to do with what's happening, say rampant child abuse, and the shakedown mightn't work. Tying corporeal things like incarceration rates in the Northern Territory, life expectancy among Aborigines, or school graduation rates in Indigenous communities, to abstract feelings on the subject among fellow citizens seems an odd play. There's a sort of rough attempt to make it seem as though this state of affairs exists because you've not been paying enough mind to it, as though your psychic emanations will suffice as a cure. After all, the word awareness is now firmly imprinted in one's mind, along with ribbons and heart-wrenching television adverts. It's a nasty sort of guilty paradox, that their miserable state exists in part because of your not-so-miserable state. The back end of it is to imply that, should you vote no on our upcoming referendum, you've demonstrated the will, if not the means, to carpet-bomb every remote community back to the Stone Age. By their opinions on matters that cost them nothing, you shall know them, I suppose. The worst of it is that there is a hardening against real human suffering that comes in the wake of this artificial virtue. Like the well-documented phenomena of vegans shoplifting from supermarkets, there is the sense that by making the right noises at social gatherings, we have balanced the ethical scales, paid our dues, and can go on with life in good conscience. For many Australians, this will be how they are thinking as the vote draws near. That this will not make them good people in the Aristotelian sense, and will do less for those toward whom they address their abstract principles, is beside the point. It is merely another means by which our moral schema is degraded in the postmodern West, where appearance trumps substance. Everybody should take a good look at the Nicomachean ethics. What we do is more important than what we say, though this is not to suggest the two aren't related. I am reminded of an old Croatian farmer I knew in northern WA, who was about as racist as they come, but was happy to employ Aborigine workers on his farms, provided they worked. He did more for their prospects than any right-thinking urbanite, and in a fashion that carried real risk for his own prospects too. It is possible for a person, as anybody who knows themselves must concede, to be walking evidence of contradictory things, and none of us will ever quite topple our own whited sepulchre entirely. But to encourage the rankest, shallowest hypocrisy in the nation, writ large, that is an achievement worthy of the maestros of public mood that fill the histories of the last century. It seems a country of Mrs. Jellybys is less useful than one foul-mouthed Croat with a few too many missing teeth.